Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking today about kind of these connections between behaviorism and evolutionary psychology, and about this idea that we actually evolved to train others. And I've gotten a lot of different responses to this talk. Actually, anthropologists, I was really surprised. I thought I would get a very, very chilly response from anthropologists. Anthropologists tend to like it. Psychologists have mixed views. It really depends. So whatever your criticisms are, I'm happy to hear them. And also just keep in mind that this is very speculative. It covers a lot of things. I'll be talking about everything from non-human animals, a little bit about domestication, a little bit about personality disorders. It's going to really run a very wide, theoretical bandwidth. So just keep that in mind. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the extended phenotype. So Dawkins wrote a book called The Extended Phenotype, and it was basically talking about how our phenotype is not just our physical form, but also the influence that we have on the environment. And many of the simplest organisms physiologically in the world, or organisms like parasites who don't actually need a lot of their own organs because they manipulate others to provide places for them to live and reproduce and breed. And so this hairworm, which is a very, very simple organism, actually has the psychological effect on this grasshopper of causing it to jump into the water so that it can continue its life cycle. Cordyceps, which is a fungus, also is adapted for specific insect classes. Each cordyceps species is adapted to a specific host species, and it can manipulate them to go all the way up into a tree or on a blade of grass so that it can better disperse its spores. So while these two organisms seem pretty simple, a hairworm and a fungus, they actually have very complex interactions with their host organism. And in this is kind of a really also good example of conflict between organisms. So it's in the best interest of the cordyceps for the ant to walk up a tree. It's in the best interest for this hairworm, for this grasshopper to jump in the water. And this is where conflict comes into play. And you also see conflict within species. So there's conflict between mothers and offspring, right? So babies, actually fetuses, will manipulate their mothers in various ways to not eat and to eat certain foods. It's actually the fetus that manipulates the mother and to keep sugar around. That's why there's gestational diabetes. That's why there's higher blood pressure during pregnancy. These are ways that the fetus and the mother, and ultimately the child and the mother, their preferences and their goals adaptively are not in alignment with one another. And so you see that there's this interaction that is conflict. They call that parent-offspring conflict. But also there's interactions between men and women called the battle of the sexes that can be seen as adversarial. And it's actually not the case that all men and all women are actually adversarial with each other as groups. In general, actually, you have more conflict with those, more at stake with those of the same sex as you than those of the opposite sex. So you're not really aligned necessarily with people of the same sex, but people of the same sex tend to have the same problems in heterosexual romantic partnerships overall. And that's why you see these kinds of battle of the sexes conflicts that people talk about, and that you see a lot in things like popular culture. So what I'm talking about basically is something which you could call strategic interference and strategic facilitation. So strategic interference is a strategy is anything that you're trying to do, and it can be either proximate or it can be distal. So you might be trying to impress other people with a story about how you fought off a mugger, and then your friend might conflict with your strategy, interfere with your strategy by saying, oh, the mugger, ran away right away. There was never a punch thrown. Everything actually was fine. And furthermore, that the mugger was 4 feet tall. Your friend might interfere with your strategy of making you sound really brave, for example, and you might shoot them a nasty look or tell them off or say you don't want to be friends anymore. So these are ways that our friends and other conspecifics, other humans, interfere with our strategies. And the more distal strategies can be things like increase your reproductive success. So obviously in romantic relationships, there's a lot of strategies at play, and there's a lot of facilitation and interference that can happen because to a large extent, men and women are not actually aligned in their strategies. So one of the first ever behaviorist findings was something called the law of effect. And this law of effect was only, behaviorism really only started, 80 years ago or something. But this was the first thing started, and Thorndike put a cat in a puzzle box and found that the cat was likely to get out of the puzzle box faster and faster and faster on each iteration. And what the cat was using was the law of effect. If something positive happened, something that furthered the cat's strategy of getting out of the box, then the cat would do that over and over again. If something prevented it or kept it in the box longer, it would not be able to, it would be less likely to do that behavior. And what I'm arguing in this talk is that basically our psychology enacts behaviorist principles without our knowledge to a great extent, that we are rewarding and punishing each other in many ways in order to facilitate our strategies and interfere with our strategies. And later in the talk, I'll be talking about what I think are sex differences in these capabilities. So first, I'm talking about the evolved trainer. That's what I'm calling it. And you can think about it as a cognitive ability. You can think about it as a bunch of different cognitive abilities. But basically, the idea here is that we've evolved to shape others to facilitate our adaptive strategies and to punish people for or prevent conflict with our adaptive strategies, right? So this means that we are trying to reward and punish people in order to shape them to improve our outcomes when it comes to our strategies. So I don't know how familiar anthropologists are. It actually really shocks me how unfamiliar people are with behaviorism, because I know behaviorism kind of has a bad rap, you know, because I don't know if everyone here has seen A Clockwork Orange, but I think that that was a major point against behaviorism, for example. But behaviorism is an incredibly powerful meta theory, and people don't tend to learn about it. And you know, it's partly because it's shrouded in this really ridiculous nomenclature, some of which I'll talk about. A lot of it has to do with non-human animals. A lot of it involves really boring experiments. I totally buy that. But I do think that it's really important for people to understand, because it is a very encompassing meta theory. So in terms of the kind of basic principles, in case you're unfamiliar with behaviorism, is classical conditioning. That's pairing a reinforcing stimulus with a neutral stimulus. So here, this dog is being clicker trained. What you do is you click the clicker, and then you give the dog a treat. And over again, if you iterate that process, ultimately the click becomes itself a reward, and it doesn't need to always be followed by food. So the click is an indication that the dog has done something right. And it's very, very quick, which, as we'll find out more, is very important in terms of behaviorism. Operant conditioning means that the strength of a behavior is modified by its consequences, and those are positive or negative consequences. And the argument I'm making is that we're using these positive and negative consequences with one another all the time. There's also reinforcement schedules. I'll talk about that more as well. Reinforcement schedules are either rewarding a behavior every time you see it, rewarding a behavior randomly, sometimes when you see it, or otherwise not. All of these different different kinds of reinforcement schedules actually have different costs and benefits as well. There's such a thing as shaping, that is trying to get an organism to do things that you want it to do by rewarding very, very small steps in that direction, all the way up to the larger behaviors. And then there's other kinds of shaping also. And then there's finally something called a jackpot, which is popular in the non-human animal literature. That would be, let's say the dog that you're trying to train does a trick, or a dolphin, for example, does a trick that you've been trying to get the animal to do for an hour. It does it right finally, and then you just give it the whole bucket of fish, or you give it all the treats in your bag, and then you call it a day. That's a jackpot. That is a very, very strong reinforcer. And I'll argue that we are actually emotionally inclined to give people jackpots for doing things that facilitate our strategies. So these are just the elements of operant conditioning. Basically, the addition of something. Behaviorists have a problem with me saying good, because they are not always good, but this is an easy way of thinking about it. So positive reinforcement is adding something good. That is saying, I like you, or you did a great job, or giving somebody a cupcake or an orgasm, or whatever the case may be. Negative reinforcement is taking away something bad. So that is like letting an animal out of a cage, or giving it food after a long fast. That actually is a combination of positive and negative reinforcement. Then there's punishment, most commonly thought of as, hitting somebody. That's a punishment, for example. And then there's omission training. That's taking away something good. Many of you might be familiar with the so-called silent treatment, where if somebody stops talking to you because you've upset them, they are going on the condition that you enjoy talking to them, and they're going to actually omit that. They're going to take that away from you so that you will be punished for whatever behavior you engaged in. So that's kind of the basics. And because you guys have a cichlid exhibition here, I decided I would talk a little bit more about this guy. This is Erasmus, the clicker-trained fish. And just to show you kind of how powerful these principles are, Erasmus, and you can look him up on YouTube, can play many, many different games, and he's clicker-trained. So his trainer actually just flashed a white light at him, and he can do the limbo, he can play football, he can bob a ball on the top of the tank, he can circle a certain direction when he sees a right light, he can circle counterclockwise when he sees a green light. It's incredible, actually, how much he can do based on these very simple principles, because these are principles that non-human animals use in the wild. So you might wonder, why didn't we evolve to not be trainable? Well, being punished and reinforced are principles that you use when interacting with the environment. It's really impossible to get away from them. And just to show that there's, this is a really creative process as well, many of the tricks that dolphins have learned to do in captivity are actually tricks that the dolphins invented. So you can actually reward a dolphin for doing something novel, and then the dolphin will come up with more and more novel behaviors, and then you can actually attach a label to that behavior, give them treats for that behavior, and then train that particular behavior up. So these are a bunch of different behaviors that dolphins have done on the basis of things that they created. But even Erasmus, who's just a fish, you can actually do a game with him, which is called 101 Things to Do with the Rubber Band. And you give him a rubber band, and you give him a reinforcement every time he does something new. And he actually gets in kind of a state of flow where he doesn't get his treat. He doesn't surface to get his treat. He's very obsessed with finishing the creative process that he started with the rubber band as well. And there's a lot of things we didn't know until we started using behaviorist conditioning on non-human animals that animals could do. We didn't know these things about their cognition. Certainly, if I asked you all to predict whether or not you could train a fish to engage in a creative process with a rubber band, I don't think that any of you would predict that a fish could do that. And so similarly with people, you don't actually know what people can do until you control their environment with reinforcement and punishment. And I'm arguing that we're doing that in our social behavior all the time. So back to the evolved trainer. This is the way that we actually reward and punish one another. And I think that the evolved trainer is going to be especially strong in pair bonds. So in species in which the have iterated interactions and in which their fate is actually tied up together, those are going to be species in which rewarding and punishing each other, shaping each other to maximize their cooperation is actually going to be really important. So the evolved trainer should be especially strong in contexts of shared genetic fate, but also sensitive to expectations of repeated interactions, sensitivity of the target to training, the degree of agency, and the degree of motivation. Obviously, people train their children differently than they train their romantic partners. So this is a species, the only species of monogamous frog. They're very cute. They're called the mimic poison arrow frog. They look poisonous, but they are not. And they have a very weird life strategy. So what they do is the female will lay her eggs, fertilized eggs, around these different palm fronds. And this is me also speculating. I'll just flag that up because I saw this on the BBC. And the male will chirp at the female when the tadpoles get hungry. So the tadpoles emerge, and when they get hungry, they start to thrash around, and the male chirps at the female to recruit her because all the tadpoles eat are unfertilized eggs of the mother. So he recruits the female to go and lay an unfertilized egg in the pond so that the tadpole can eat it. So the tadpoles, that's their entire diet. So in this scene, the male recruits the female with these chirps, and then when she goes away, when she starts to wander off, he chirps differently in a higher pitch and at a greater frequency. And after she finishes laying the unfertilized egg for the tadpole and the tadpole is eating it, they do this kind of cuddling thing. And I think that for a small organism, it's very reinforcing for them to be covered, because if they're covered, that indicates that they're less likely to be predated upon. So what looks like a cuddle is him saying, because you fed our babies, I'm going to give you cues of proximity and security that you find reinforcing. Okay, another pair-bonded species is zebra finches, and they are also monogamous, pretty monogamous by all considerations. And these guys, they actually do selectively forage. One of them goes out for half an hour to forage, while the other one keeps the eggs warm or the chicks warm, and then they go half an hour apiece back and forth. And when they come back together after this half an hour foraging period, they sing a duet. So they sing together for a moment before the other one leaves the nest. And what some mean scientists did is they actually detained the male so that he would be gone much longer than half an hour that they had previously agreed upon, as much as zebra finches can negotiate about the curfew when they come home. And what they found was that the male came back and they did the duet, but the duet was quite different. The female sang fewer times to the male, and the male sang at a higher frequency and for longer. And you could actually call this, and they did in the press, a zebra finch argument. And basically what happened is if the male did not chirp at a high frequency or for very long, when the female next left the nest, she actually also left for longer than half an hour. So she delayed her return as well, just the way that he did, right? And so me anthropomorphizing wildly, the zebra finch is saying, where were you? And then if you don't have a good enough explanation, I will actually also leave longer. That's a delayed punishment, which is actually quite advanced. So talking about, the evolved trainer and pair bonds, in animals like the superb bird of paradise, the male advertises to the female his fitness by doing a dance, by growing symmetrical plumage, and by being vigorous and healthy. Whereas in animals like Eurasian jays, they're more monogamous, and it looks like they're actually learning one another's preferences. At least there's evidence in these animals that the males learn the preferences of the females. And why is that important? Well, if there's preferences that you're trying to learn in order to train someone else better, if you're giving somebody else foods that they don't like, or behaviors that they don't like, or conversation that they don't like, you're not going to be able to train them very well. So in Eurasian jays, for example, and in these other guys, which are called North Island robins, what they found is that if they show the female eating one food over and over and over and over again, the male is more likely to bring her a novel food, one that she's going to prefer, than he is going to bring her the food that she has been previously eating. So these males, it seems, are actually better at predicting the preferences of their mate than you would expect by chance in studies that they've done, where they've either not shown the male what the female is eating, or they have shown the male what the female is eating, and they gave her the same food over and over again. And what's important to think about is that these males, they give these females food during courtship and also during nesting. So again, this could be a way of signaling that they have the cognition to do this. That's one kind of signaling idea. But the other one would be that they're classically conditioning the female, that they're reinforcing her with her preferred food. So in humans, we see also preference memory, and I'll talk about men and women in here in a moment. But a huge amount of our memory is devoted to remembering the preferences and aversions of others. And you don't see this in non-pair bonded species. They don't really spend enough time together to learn each other's preferences and aversions. But in humans, there's a huge amount of time spent learning preferences and aversions. And I think that we experiment with one another to see how the other person responds to punishment, to intermittent reinforcement, and to extinction, how the other person responds to those kinds of behaviors. And I think that actually happens a lot during courtship. So in humans, it's actually fairly complicated to learn their preferences, but in non-human animals, their preferences are fairly simple. Even though cats are very difficult to train, they have fairly simple preferences, right? They like warmth, they like lying down, they like cat food, but humans have a huge variety of idiosyncratic preferences. People like very, very different things. They have very different aesthetic preferences. And how good are people at predicting one another's preferences? Is that actually part of the evolved trainer? And this is actually one area that I have been looking at with data. So I will present some data from my lab, from my students, but that will be a little bit later in the talk. So another thing that you would predict about the evolved trainer, if there is such a thing, would be that it would be encapsulated. And if you think about, if anybody here is familiar with evolutionary psychology, there's this idea that our cognitive capabilities, some of them talk with each other quite easily, and others of them don't. There's a lot of people who think about the human mind like it's a series of apps, right? And we often don't want others to know about our adaptive strategies because they work better if other people are unaware of what we want to do. And Rob Kurzban, in his book, Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite, talks about this as the press secretary. If you were a nation, for example, and you were going to war, an illegal war, for example, you wouldn't want to tell your press secretary about this war because you wouldn't want him or her to communicate that to the wider public. And in the same way, if you're engaging in behavior that is not normative or that is frowned upon in some way, you are also going to keep that in unconscious awareness because you don't want to advertise that you are engaging in whatever kinds of manipulative strategies. So indicating reasons for punishment and reinforcement can cause other people to resist. That's another reason we engage in what you could call self-deception about these particular behaviors. So, for example, if I tell somebody that I am trying to manipulate them to do a certain behavior, they're going to be much more likely to resist that. If I tell somebody that if they do X, Y behavior and that it's in my best interests, that's something that they might resist. And this is a major reason why I think teenagers start resisting the reinforcements and punishments of their parents. It's because they discover that their parents' interests are not aligned with their own, certainly not anymore. Awareness of antisocial motivations can be linked to kind of reputational damage. Obviously, there have been psychopaths throughout evolutionary history, and I think that psychopaths are much more aware of the manipulative techniques that they use with others. I think that some of the difference between people who do not have psychopathy and people who do is just the awareness of the manipulation that they're engaging in. And the most effective reinforcements and punishments occur really quickly after the behavior, as quickly as possible. In non-human animals, even a delay of 1 second can cause the reinforcement not to work, or for the wrong behavior to potentially be reinforced. So there's this selection for automaticity, for engaging in that behavior as quickly as possible, or engaging that reinforcement and punishment as quickly as possible. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule. A rat can learn that a food is poisonous, even if the rat doesn't get sick until the next day. But in general, the quicker the punishment, the quicker the reinforcement, the easier the learning is for a specific behavior. So the idea here, and in the same way that Freud's idea about the unconscious was very convenient, my idea about the evolved trainer is that it's actually mostly blind to conscious awareness. So if we think about emotions from the view of this evolved trainer, from this behaviorist viewpoint, you can think about, for example, anger and outrage as being the desire to punish others. So that motivates your memory for how to punish the target, the person that you're trying to punish or reinforce or change their behavior, and also reinforces the punishment, and often reinforces the punishment or causes the punishment to occur as quickly as possible. Sadness can be used as punishment if the target that you're looking at is empathetic towards you, but also can be used as a way of eliciting behavior that you want to reinforce. So you can talk about negative reinforcement in that way. So if you are very sad and you're crying, and then somebody does something that you like, you stop crying, that is a way of reinforcing them if they find your sadness and your crying and your suffering painful. I think sometimes people cry in front of people who don't care about them. Obviously, that's a kind of error management thing that I'll talk about in a bit. There's also surprise, gratitude, and happiness. And these are responses that motivate reinforcing the other person. So gratitude motivates understanding what the other person likes, and their preferences, for example, motivates the memory for target-specific reinforcements, and also reinforcement to target depending on expectation, right? So, for example, being surprised by somebody's good behavior towards you can motivate what you might call a jackpot, which is the most reinforcing behavior that you can muster towards that person, understanding their preferences. So that's a jackpot because it's trying to reinforce that behavior for iterated interactions, because that behavior is in line with your strategies. Another way of looking at behaviorism and emotions is to think about clicks and tones. So as I talked about before, obviously the click, it's classically conditioned with food, and then ultimately the click itself becomes reinforcing. But you also see this with shock collars. So shock collar is obviously really controversial, but you can put a shock collar on a dog, and what happens is it will get a tone before the shock. So there's some warning that the punishment is about to happen, and then the tone itself becomes punishing because it's been paired with this electrical stimulation. And in my view, emotions have a similar kind of function, right? They indicate that a punishment or a reinforcement is about to come, and they're more immediate. So that's the really tricky thing about behaviorism, is that the immediacy of the stimulus is really important. So somebody can give you a look and then you know a significant punishment is going to follow, or someone can give you a look and you know a significant reward behavior is, or reward to you is going to happen after that. So those are ways that you actually can use your face. And I'll talk a little bit about how women are more facially expressive than men, and why in a little bit. So these emotional expressions, they can act as clicks and tones. So we're biologically prepared. You know, there's some evidence, for example, that infants like smiles right away when they come out of the womb. But also it has been classically conditioned. You've seen a smile paired with a good reinforcing stimulus many times. You've seen an angry face paired with a punishing stimulus many times. So in addition, you have learned these associations as well. And it can also act as a discriminative stimulus. So it can indicate whether we can expect reward or punishment with a given behavior in the context of that expression. So the same way where you act different with each person, you know that different behaviors are things that they like and that they don't like. Someone can also give you a different facial expression, and then you know that there's different things that will be rewarded and different things that will be punished. In the same way that a dog knows that when you say sit, it's actually the best thing for him to sit, rather than doing some other behavior that he's been trained to do. Sit is also a discriminative stimulus. So why is punishment used so often? The behaviorists actually had a really ambivalent view about punishment, and they often said that punishment doesn't work. If you look at a lot of books on animal training, for example, they talk about punishment not working. And in the field of cognitive behavioral therapy and applied behavioral analysis, which people use with, for example, learning disabled or autistic children and adults, punishment is very, very rarely used, if at all, right? So there's this very ambivalent view of punishment in our culture and in behaviorism generally. But unfortunately, punishment does work, and that's why we are motivated to do it in part. So punishment, kind of from an evolutionary perspective, takes less time and attention than using iterated rewards. So shaping takes a long time, and the kind of way that we're prepared to behaviorally engage with children actually involves shaping, rewarding them for very small successive steps in the right direction. But the way that we train other adults, especially people that we don't know very well, or especially during periods of stress, is strongly in favor of punishment. And we punish even when it seems unlikely from the outside that punishment will actually work to engage the behavior that we want. So, for example, animals punish other animals when they are in pain. So, for example, there was a study done with rats, and what they did was they electrified the floor. One rat was tied up, the other one was freely roaming around, and the rat that was freely roaming around attacked the tied rat. Because even though the tied rat has nothing to do with the electrification of the floor, the rat that was roaming around was engaging in what I would talk about as error management. So error management is this, mostly I've seen it mostly in evolutionary psychology, which is that there's two kinds of errors you can make. It's also called the smoke detector principle. So one kind of error a smoke detector can make is that can go off when there is no fire. That's one kind of error. Another kind of error a smoke detector can make is it can not go off when there is a fire. That's the opposite of just a second. So those are the two kinds of errors it could make. And obviously the less costly error is for the smoke alarm to go off when there is no fire than for it to not go off when there is a fire. So a smoke detector is biased in that direction. And I argue that most organisms are also biased to punish, even when punishment is very unlikely to work, because not punishing is more costly than punishing if this is the caveat, if the other person is not much bigger and stronger than you, but in the case of fairly equal people. So for example, we punish others in contexts where intentional harm is really ambiguous, right? So in one study, they found that low blood sugar was the best predictor of whether or not couples had an argument. An argument is, in my view, reciprocal punishment. So in this case, hangry couples, if anyone's ever heard of the wonderful juxtaposition of the word hungry and the word angry, everybody's experienced it before, they're much more likely to punish each other. They're much more likely to argue, even though the other person has nothing to do with your low blood sugar, right? And we also punish others regardless of whether or not we're going to have iterated interactions with them, right? When you curse somebody out because they pulled out in front of you on the road, you're not very likely to have an iterated interaction with them, but you expect that, and you want to shape their behavior towards you potentially in the future. And people punish for all kinds of things. People punish their children for bedwetting. Bedwetting is not under conscious control. Punishing a child for that is not going to help at all. But we have this bias to punish. In the Hangry study, now I remember this, they also asked people to use a voodoo doll, basically, to put pins in an effigy of their partner. And when people were hungrier, they were more likely to put more pins in the effigy of their partner. So I think that that's a very fun dependent variable as dependent variables go. So in my view, there's been this kind of arms race in terms of being trained and being trainable, and then also being resistant to training. So I'm not going to talk a lot about resistance to training, but I do think that men and women I do believe that there are sex differences in this particular domain. So in the training arms race, have women won the training arms race in this iterated interaction between men and women? Well, my view is actually pretty straightforward, is that women cannot use force or physical threats to compel others to facilitate their strategies as easily as men. What's the easiest way to get somebody to do what you want? Is to beat them up or threaten to beat them up, right? And so you actually don't need to use more sophisticated strategies unless that strategy is unavailable to you. The stakes for training are fairly high for women. So going back to this little picture here, males of all different kinds of mammalian species kill females' offspring. They actually don't kill females that often, but they often kill females' offspring. And so there are these aggressive males around, and it's very important from a female perspective to ensure that they don't kill you or kill your offspring. Women have to, they bear the brunt of the labor of training infants and children in order to engage in the world socially adequately, but also to avoid danger, to eat the right foods, to forage, and also not to beat up or kill their siblings, which is another thing that happens that's very bad for a woman's reproductive success. And it's unclear why, but women's hierarchies, women's social groups are actually much more shifting and mixed than men's are, right? The hierarchies are not nearly as stable, and women are all very, very good at training each other. And if women are engaging in alloparenting, helping each other out, also engaging in gossip and reputational damage, it's very important that women know how to train one another. Whereas in men, obviously there's prestige in hierarchy, but there's also dominance in hierarchy. It's a more straightforward kind of hierarchy oftentimes. And just who is biggest and strongest has been a better predictor for a longer time than actually, how sophisticated they are at psychologically understanding one another. Okay, so a woman who's good at shaping others will be better at shaping offspring. And one way of assessing ability to train others is to see how well a woman trains you. So in this one sense, it actually might make sense for a man to sexually select women who are really good at training. In elephants, if you see elephants mating, the male will mount the female, and then she'll walk backwards, 50 meters or further. And if the male stays on, he gets to mate. So it's not that she's ambivalent about mating. She's only ambivalent about mating with a male who can't stay on. And in the same way, a male actually resists training. You could say that that's a way of assessing a woman's ability to train others, because in terms of a long-term partnership, you want a female who is actually better at behaviorally conditioning others, including children and others in the social group. So are there training design features in women? Are there differences between men and women in their psychological makeup that makes women better at training? Well, one controversial idea is this idea that women show greater emotional lability. This is something that James Damore got in massive trouble for. He said women are more neurotic than men. If you look at the big 5 personality characteristics, that is one characteristic that women show a higher mean in, but it's also called emotional lability. And that means that women on average show faster mood shifts. And if you were trying to make a training algorithm, you would want that algorithm to be able to shift quickly from reinforcement to punishment. So one possibility is that emotional ability is actually a feature and not a bug. It's a feature of being able to see behavior quickly. And I don't know how many of you have ever spent time with a toddler, but they can go from doing something very good to something outright dangerous from one moment to the next. So it's important to be able to shift from reward to punishment very quickly, especially if you were looking after multiple children. Facial expressiveness and sensitivity to facial expressions, and also nonverbal cues of pleasure and pain. There's mixed results about how much better women are assessing emotional expressions than men, but there's still very good evidence that women are more facially expressive than men are, that their faces move more and that their facial expressions are more intense, which goes back to my comparison of facial expressions with things like clicks and tones, right? Indicating either that a punishment is imminent or reinforcement is imminent. And women also are probably better at remembering the preferences and aversions of others. So this has been found in a few different studies. So in gift giving, for example, women are better at selecting gifts for others than men are. Even if you just show a woman a picture of somebody, she's better at selecting things that they will like, regardless of whether that person is the same sex or a different sex than she is. In studies that I've done recently, I've also found that in heterosexual romantic couples, women are on average have higher accuracy when assessing the preferences of others when it comes to domains like food, about what kinds of films the other person will like. And that's we have 54 romantic couples that we looked at, and it also seemed that what they call social intelligence, people's ability to read facial expressions, was associated strongly with their accuracy of predictions, how accurate they were at assessing whether or not the person they were in a relationship with liked or disliked certain things. Pretty surprisingly, though, in my study and in previous studies about preference accuracy, what we find is that the longer a couple has been together, the less accurate their preferences get. It's actually couples who've been together a shorter amount of time who have greater preference accuracy. So maybe the stakes are higher early on. I'm not really sure. But one idea has to do with courtship and the proximity of courtship. So, what is courtship really for? Why do we learn so much about each other? It seems like a massive waste of time. And yet, we're really motivated to learn as much as possible about each other. And Skinner talked about, B.F. Skinner talked about the relationship between a therapist and a client as something called unconditional positive regard, right? If the therapist responds just sort of neutrally positively to everything that the client does, the therapist is going to see the most variation in the behavior of the client. And ultimately, they're going to see a much larger swath of behavior than any other person in that person's life sees. And that's similar to what you see in courtship. So in courtship, this unconditional positive regard elicits the largest and best behavioral repertoire. If you're trying to figure out what behaviors you can shape and punish, what you first want to see is kind of what you're working with, right? What is this library of behavior that you have at your disposal? And people during courtship show a very large variation in their behavior as well. Although obviously it is rose tinted. You see many things in courtship that you will never see again, and you see many things in courtship that are untrue in some sense about the person's character. In courtship, you learn the preferences and the aversions of other people so that you can use those preferences and aversions to potentially train them later. The positive power of association that happens during courtship makes sure that certain aspects of you become classically conditioned with reinforcement. So obviously falling in love is very exciting. And during the process of courtship, your face, your voice, other person's characteristics become reinforcing in and of themselves. That's why somebody can use silent treatment as punishment, because interacting with that person has become a huge reinforcement, and taking it away as a punishment. I don't know if we'll go into this. Hold on. Okay, so another thing that is, women might be better at than men, indicating that women might be better at training others, is they might be better at remembering the preferences and aversions of others, but also women have better autobiographical memory. And what I would predict is that women would be better at remembering kind of what worked and what didn't in the past. But you could also even make a larger claim here in that human extended sexuality has something to do with training. We are the only species in which women have sex throughout pregnancy, after menopause, and throughout the menstrual cycle, and other than like bonobos, right? And so it's very important potentially because sex is a very, very strong reinforcer. And to have that tool of reinforcement at your disposal all the time, I even, I wrote a paper about bisexuality, basically making the same case, that you can use sex to reinforce the behavior of not only people of the opposite sex, not only people that you are potentially going to have offspring with, but also people of the same sex who you would like on your side in various different ways. And there's a whole spectrum of sexual behavior, from intercourse to, just something that you might just call affection. So another piece of evidence that women might be better at shaping is the study where they followed married couples for several years. So 141 couples were followed for 4 years. And here I'm sort of redefining forgiveness as a negative reinforcement. So if anger is punishing, then forgiveness means that that is a negative reinforcement that women are using. And a woman who's less forgiving is somebody who's also more likely to be punishing their partner more often. And what the study was looking at was whether or not men and women change after they're in long-term relationships. And what it found was that less forgiving wives had husbands with significantly more self-control at the end of 4 years, right? So what it seems that might have been happening is that women were actually shaping men with punishment to exercise greater self-control. This didn't look at any specific behavior. It was looking at sort of the trait of self-control instead. Wives who had lower levels of forgiveness at the beginning of marriages showed higher levels of increase in their level of forgiveness of their partner over time. So this is exactly what you would expect if someone was iteratively doing more and more of what you wanted, that you would reinforce them more and more, and that you would become less likely to engage in angry behavior. I'm really enjoying one person who's looking at this through their fingers. That's really good. Husband's forgiveness, however, was not associated with wife's self-control, right? So it doesn't actually seem that women's traits were being changed by their husband's anger or lack thereof over the course of the 4 years that they followed these married couples. Okay. So the last thing I'll say that's a little bit controversial, and then I'll break for questions right at 45 minutes, is that you can think, actually, no, I will talk about a couple more things. I'll go through this quickly. Is that borderline personality disorder and other personality disorders can be thought of as ways that people are training others. I can even think about attachment styles this way, right? In that whether or not you're more prone to use punishment or use reinforcement. So people with borderline personality disorder, and the majority of people with borderline personality disorder, in terms of my understanding, are women. They tend to engage in something called idealization and devaluation, right? They shift very quickly from idolizing their partners to insulting their partners. And it actually is a very volatile kind of relationship that these women often have with their partners. And what they tend to be most punitive towards is any kind of cue of abandonment, which is exactly what you might expect if we are actually punishing others for behaviors that would have been detrimental to our fitness ancestrally. So in the modern environment where people spend many, many hours apart per day, and they often engage with each other in non-face-to-face kinds of interactions, that's where you're going to see some perversion of these kind of training techniques, because they're not the kind of natural way that we evolved to train others. So just kind of to make some conclusions here, in my view, we've evolved to use behaviorist techniques in order to shape others, to facilitate our adaptive strategies and prevent conflict with our adaptive strategies. We remember others' preferences and aversions, what elicits pleasure and pain, in order to create what I would call bespoke or customized shaping regimes for other people. We never are sure kind of what's going to come in handy. You know, for example, a story that will embarrass somebody, you know, a context or a stimulus that's going to disgust them or make them feel happy. And I think that conversation often has these kinds of punishments and reinforcements embedded in them, right? Women might be better at shaping others than men. That's why I'm calling this How to Train Your Boyfriend. And there might be this arms race, right, where others who want to be resistant to training, they might be defiant, they might become desensitized to the other person's reinforcement and punishment. So I didn't talk about that very much here, but I do definitely think that that's a dynamic that happens, especially in romantic couples. And I didn't get into this at all, but I can see conflict, abuse, and neglect can be seen through this lens of the evolved trainer, right? You can punish somebody so that they no longer engage in behaviors that would potentially attract another person or would enable them to meet another person and abandon you, for example. So is it ethical? A lot of people have had various kinds of problems. I get very, bipolar interactions about this topic where people say, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. And some people say, well, you'd never title a talk, How to Train Your Girlfriend. So this is really misandrist, as in man-hating, right? But I think that understanding our evolved psychology can really help us be mindful. So I think that a really great thing for men to know about is something that's called sexual overperception bias. Men are more likely to perceive sexual interest on the part of women than women think that they're revealing themselves, right? And that's because it's a more costly mistake for a man to miss cues of sexual interest than it is for him to infer cues of sexual interest that are not actually not there, right? That's another example of error management. And I think when men become aware of this, they can actually interact with women in a way that you could call better. I mean, I'm not going to get all Me Too on you guys, but yeah. Right now, our attention and behaviors are already being hacked by behaviorist techniques, but they're being hacked for things that we don't really feel good about doing, right? For example, if any of you are on Twitter, I was listening to Jaron Lanier talk about these behaviorist techniques that different social media uses, and you might notice that there's a little delay before your notifications come up when you log into things like Facebook and Twitter. That little delay actually makes people's behavior stickier, makes you stay on the site longer than if there was not that small delay. Because what they're reinforcing you is actually staying on the site longer. They're taking out that reinforcement, for example. So yeah, our reinforcement and punishment, our minds are already being hacked in various different ways to sell products, but especially by video games which induce this state of flow because they're perfect at shaping people to their level. I didn't talk about this very much, but there's a game that's popular in Japan mostly, which is called Love Plus, where it's men who play this game. There's 3 different schoolgirls that they can interact with. There's no sex or anything like that. And they just interact with them. And they take these, basically a girl on an app on a date. And there's tens of thousands of men who have these virtual girlfriends. And that's because this video game, which is very much like a relationship, is hacking that reinforcement structure so perfectly and really iterating the process of shaping in a way that's optimal. So, we're already being hacked a lot by others. I think that if we learn better actually what's going on when we want to reinforce and punish others, then we can engage in reinforcement and punishment in a more mindful way. Because I think that we're all already very manipulative. I just think that it's important for us to be aware of why we're manipulating others, why we feel angry, why we feel upset, why we feel happy, why we feel grateful, and in order to better form our relationships. One thing that you see all the time is what, in the clinical literature they call codependency. And, there's quite a simple explanation for that. That's where people are reinforcing others for being dependent on them and punishing them for showing any kind of independence. That's the dynamic that's happening there. And if people become aware of what they're doing, they can become much better at consciously using these techniques to get what they want, as opposed to their knee-jerk kind of evolved response. So I say we're feeling emotions we don't understand to solve ancestral problems that no longer exist in ways that undermine our conscious goals and our relationships. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. That was really interesting. Are you happy to take any questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to take all